Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lucy. I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend, and we are joined today by Natalie, who is also from Turner & Townsend, who's going to be giving our presentation today. The purpose of this event, so it's a retrofit information support and expertise, so RISE event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner & Townsend. So thank you again for everyone joining. I'll now hand over to Natalie to kick us off with the presentation.
Oh, thanks, Lucy. Good morning, everyone. I'm presenting today mainly because my background with Turner & Townsend so far has been to support strategic partnerships as they deliver retrofit. So that's the forming and the management of consortium. My background previously was actually in regeneration, where it's a lot of, you can imagine, stakeholder juggling between political parties at a local level, but also residents and your internal teams. So it feels very much like an extension of bringing different stakeholders together to make a project happen. So the other reason we're doing this session today is because we're actually in the midst of doing some research into how consortia work and how they deliver retrofits successfully, and also the risks inherent in working together as a partnership. And part of that research will be shared with through the RISE channel that we have, but I'll kind of allude to a few of the findings today, which basically forms the structure of the session. So let's just have a small moment just to see in the chat who might have dropped any information about what your experience is. There's nothing in there yet, but I really highly recommend you popping it in so we can have a meaningful discussion at the end. Okay, so that just again, if you're working in a consortium, please let us know. And if you have past experience of delivering retrofit in a consortium and would like to do that again, please let us know in the chat. So if we have a think about how consortia have achieved success over the last few years of SHDF and HUG funding, what we've seen recently in the 2.2 application was about 4 consortia who came together for that. We haven't got any performance data yet because they're just starting to deliver. In terms of SHDF Wave 2.1, there are about 25 consortia who are delivering right now with varying sizes. That's everything from 2 members through to about 27 members for the larger consortium. These consortia are led by different grant recipients, so the lead applicant, as it's titled in the fund, which is either a local authority, combined authority, or registered providers. In HUG, that is only for local authorities, and therefore the 24 consortia who are delivering HUG 2 are led by a local authority or combined authority. Those ones have larger range of members, so that goes from 2 members through to about 60 members in the case of a net zero hub. And the performance varies quite differently between how HUG are delivering and how SHDF are delivering. Again, if you do have any experience and are currently delivering SHDF or HUG, it could be interesting just to talk about partnership working and any of the barriers you found and some of the resolutions to overcoming those. In terms of consortia characteristics, what we see is quite a difference in stock holding of members. There isn't a let's say a finding yet around who often collaborates. We're seeing very mature partners with lots of stock pairing with smaller partners with fewer stock, and that in a way balances out the skill and knowledge in the consortium model. We're also seeing a spread of those who are cooperating at a regional level, but also those who are cooperating at national levels. And in that national kind of model of consortia, we're seeing that they're finding learnings between archetype, sharing knowledge about archetypes and how to treat similar properties that are at different ends of the country. So all of this is just a bit of background to say that we're seeing a lot of variety in how partnerships form, and some of the success factors we've picked out here are common amongst those consortia. Okay, so in today's session, we'll go over those success factors, and they break down into communication and transparency, looking then into roles and responsibilities about how the consortium formed, then a bit more around processes in terms of consortia agreements and management tools and risk. In terms of overview of the success factors, this is what we've observed is contributing to successful forming and management of consortium. Here you have communication and transparency, which we'll go into in a minute. Roles and responsibilities, I think this definitely varies depending on the consortium model. So in terms of models, what I'm talking about is fund administrator. So you might have a lead applicant as required by a fund who will hold the money and distribute it out to the individual members, because there has to be a lead applicant who liaises with the department in terms of that monthly reporting and grant drawdown. But the members themselves are in charge of their own management of the supply chain and delivery of the works. Another common model that we see is managing agent, and that's where you might have the lead applicant procuring another retrofit, a retrofit specialist or a main contractor who then serves as a supply chain to service all the other members. And that's what we'll talk about a bit in the roles and responsibilities. Consortium agreements, you might be familiar with having a non-legally binding agreement in partnerships such as MOUs, a memorandum of understanding, or a collaboration agreement. Usually with funding, it is required that there's some due diligence done in the background beforehand of members coming together and an agreement in place to make sure that there can be a cooperation in cases of failure to meet the performance outcomes or any other issues that might come with actual delivery of the works. In terms of planning tools, it's part of just good project management and keeping that alignment between all of the parties. In this section, we'll just have a little look at aspects such as keeping risk registers, project management, communication tools, and forums for cooperation. And in risk management, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that you'll have your own internal culture of risk management, but it's about finding processes that align for everyone so that you have that unified approach that allows you to feel comfortable, especially as a lead applicant, in the fact that you'll be able to preempt any issues that are going to arise during delivery. In terms of communication, I think when you're working in that partnership, you're asking a lot from very mature organizations. Sometimes you will have cultural differences as well in terms of how you operate as a housing association, local authority, registered provider. And so when we're coming together in a group for a consortium, those cultural different ways of working and other commitments and other projects can have a strain and produce a delivery risk. So in terms of having clear communication as a success factor, this can reduce the burden of meetings, avoid the loss of information between members, and set the correct expectations for deliverables during the forming and the delivery of works. In terms of success factors, what we've seen is establishing those forums for communication, meaning from the get-go of forming a consortium, you have terms of reference about how you're going to operate, scheduled meetings, having that governance process agreed, and understanding who's going to attend which meetings. Additionally, in line with meetings, you have that management structure, understanding if there is a seniority level of governance that needs to be put in place and how different issues are escalated. So for communication, who is going to be dealing with the day-to-day, who's going to be dealing with the sign-off and approvals. That's really important to have set out at the start. The second part of successful communication is having that established ways of working. Like I said, agreeing and aligning that culture of ways of working as members within a consortium structure. Those terms of references you might agree are response rates depending on the level of importance of a query. So, you know, when one member has a query, who's in charge of replying and what level of sign-off does it require is really easy to overlook until you're in the moment when you're desperately trying to get an application together or getting reporting information together. Another best practice we've observed has been around focused consortium days. That can sound like a bit of a pipe dream, but one day a month committed to coming together to have an oversight board, addressing any queries around reporting and addressing any application preparation has been a way of making sure that everyone's aligned, they've cleared their diary and they've given themselves the space to work on the consortium matters away from their day-to-day of delivering their work in their own organisation. Another success factor we've seen around establishing ways of working is understanding which shared platforms you're going to be using. So for example, if you are able to host a shared point file dedicated to the consortium, this is a fantastic way of just keeping everyone working on the latest version. Simple things, but it's not always the easiest thing to set up if you don't have a data sharing agreement in place. So we've seen a bit of a lead in time when consortia are forming to get those sort of processes signed off and that access to a shared platform established so that you can work through the application process and into delivery and reporting quite seamlessly. Transparency comes hand in hand with communication. Clearly, there are sensitive issues that are commercially sensitive and confidential for your own organisation, but it is another part of showing that you are prepared to work together. It also means that non-disclosure of issues can lead to dropouts we've seen, and delays in approvals leading to distrust and frustration. Transparency at its heart is actually it's a very personable issue here. So it's making sure that there is an understanding of the methodologies that are used in each organization for managing risks, because we assume quite often that we have the similar processes that are dictated by regulation, but there may be additional ones per organization. It's also having an understanding of how decisions are made, for example, through your investment committees, disposal committees, asset management boards. Having those mapped out and understanding the cadence of those across the members does support being able to get sign-off when you do need it for an application, for example, or when there are changes during delivery, understanding what those lead-in times might need to be in order to have that approach collaboratively as a consortium. Having an understanding of the quality and quantity of data available when you're first forming a consortium is also important. From this, I'm talking about asset data. Quite often, we're working on different energy software, modeling software platforms, and our data might not come out in the same sort of way. So you might have different metrics that you're looking at. When you're creating your consortium bid, or if you're working together to do monthly reporting, it's important that there is a standardized approach at some point. Of course, you'll have your own systems, but it's agreeing that standardized approach and understanding how you're going to bring together your different reporting, your different data, asset data, in a way that can be understood by the central consortium lead. Transparency over budgets as well is often one that is probably not talked about enough, I think, during the application stage. And that's because obviously you might not immediately have sign-off. But as a lead applicant, you need to do a bit of due diligence to know that your members have the correct approvals in place so that it doesn't cause an issue once funding is awarded and grant funding agreements need to be signed. So an understanding of where everyone's at in the process of getting budgetary sign-off will be key. It's also useful to understand where there are already areas for improvement that members are working towards. I think this is most obvious when we're looking at data inequalities. So, for example, when a consortium forms, you might see that some members have more advanced data and maybe monitoring data of how previous interventions are performing in previous retrofit projects. If another member is not quite at that same level of detail, it's important to understand if there's a pathway to improving their data, and that sharing that as a group is also a way for you to learn different methods from each other in terms of improving your own processes. And last point on this transparency one is clarity around principles and trade-offs. When we're working in a partnership, of course, it's best if we can form around common goals and strategies, but there will be a case where there needs to be a trade-off sometimes. And that might be in terms of the amount of resource you're able to commit at a stage, or it might be in terms of the amount of properties that you can put into a bid for which meet the correct criteria. Having conversations around what those trade-offs are that you're having to have in your organizations in order to work together is also another key to successfully working transparently. Roles and responsibilities is one of those that, as a project manager, I'm sure you have to get right from the start. In terms of those consortia models we talked about at first, we do see that there's a difference in how consortia are resourced. For example, sometimes there is a hub, which is a dedicated shared resource who may control, let's say, the project management office functions. So they might typically involve a bit of the KPI reporting, the data analysis on the stock improvements, and also be managing any of the queries that need to be escalated up to an oversight board for the consortium. Ultimately, there will need to be assigned resource either within the lead applicant, a shared resource, or distributed amongst the members that covers off some of these areas: procurement, project management, resident engagement, risk management, data analysis, KPI reporting, technical support, and a project sponsor. So if we look at one of these in particular, we might want to consider the risk of not having someone who's focused on the data analysis. Of course, in that case, you end up with a less standardized approach, because when you have someone who can oversee and own that discipline for the consortium, it does enable you to have a more standard approach that avoids having to kind of stitch together different sets of data, and it gives you one person who can own a process and find those efficiencies. Ultimately, what you're doing is you're collaborating to make the team stronger. And we've seen that shared resource, in particular, having someone to manage KPI reporting, being a great benefit of taking the burden off of all the different members. Roles and responsibilities, I don't think we do this enough often when we're coming together in a partnership. I haven't included it in this slide, but a pre-stage when you're forming a consortium that we've seen works is doing a bit of a maturity assessment around everyone's skills and abilities and experience in delivering retrofit, and identifying those members who might have a strength in procurement, for example. When you're looking at this, having someone who can lead on procurement enables you to upskill all your other members, but it also allows you to already look ahead at perhaps the resource need and the frequency of their input. So, for example, if we look at roles and responsibilities mapping for informing or just, checking in on the management of your current consortium model, you might want to understand, is there additional need for this person to be involved during the application stage, so that you can have them attend certain consortium meetings to weigh in and give advice on what would be needed to either do a more, let's say, standard approach to procurement, or at least to advise on the different procurement routes that those members will be taking. Obviously, they'll have their own organizational procurement teams that they'll be working with towards their own regulations. However, having someone who understands how the consortia are working at a whole and how they've been delivering is a very useful perspective to have. Another way of re-looking at your responsibilities and understanding, are we in a place where we feel like we've got all of these different disciplines covered off, would be creating organizational charts for your consortium model. Although I appreciate those might not be formalized in a strategy, so not all consortia have formed to deliver works collaboratively, some form for an application as opposed to for a longer strategic goal. It's still useful to map this out and understand, do you have the right levels of governance? Strong leadership in a consortium does make and break it, and we have seen consortia drop out having received funding because they have not been able to deliver under a strong leader. That leader themselves was not able to deliver. And so you can imagine setting it out straight like this, understanding where the project sponsor is, the project managers are, and all of the supporting functions that feed into it. It also allows you to start building up a backup plan to understand who the seconds might be if someone has to drop out. Now, not that it has to be all doom and gloom, but there are those realities that, costs increase, internal strategic direction changes, budgets change, people leave companies. And so there is a risk that someone who's an organization who's a lead applicant might have to step back. And as I said, prepare a second who can step up and take that place so that the rest of the consortium doesn't falter. There is that risk in working in a consortium model that you need to be prepared for dropouts, you need to be prepared for changes, and therefore consortium agreements are one way to manage that process successfully. In these next slides is a bit more text heavy. It serves as a checklist so that the attendees can have a look at them in more detail. But what I've done here is just break it down into a few topics, which are a good way to start thinking about before entering into agreement what you need to do. Deciding on that leadership structure is going to be key. Deciding on the leader can be part of that skills mapping task. Understanding someone who has a lot more experience in delivering retrofit can be very crucial. However, I will say it doesn't necessarily need to be a stockholder. We've seen very successful consortia form around combined authorities who have instead not been the stockholder and have created that, kind of objective perspective on how to manage the consortium going forward. Determining who will lead and understanding how they will oversee and manage the oversight is also going to be key at that stage. So in your agreement, you're setting out the roles and responsibilities of that lead applicant and perhaps why they've been put in that position, and then who would make a good second in that case. Before the agreement as well, there's a bit of due diligence to conduct. So that's credit checks on all members, but also it's a look into the performance of previous delivery and understanding, are you the right cultural match? Are you the right experience match? And is everyone aware of the amount of commitment it is required of joining a consortium? During most funding applications, a lead applicant will need to sign a declaration stating that they have done due diligence on their members. So this is an important piece to get right at the start. In terms of the operating model, I mentioned as well, depending on how your consortium is going to be functioned, think about how you would want to see the financial flow work. There's going to have to be a way to manage the grant monies, as well as monitoring co-funding spend during the delivery of retrofit works. Understanding what each organisation needs or in terms of their governance processes internally to release funds, receive funds, does help you in drafting up your consortia agreement in a way that works for everyone. You might also want to consider how that consortium agreement could work for future waves of funding, so that it gives you that flexibility in terms of additional monies that become available, so that you don't have to go right back to the drawing board and rewrite the whole consortium agreement. Although I will put a disclaimer on that I am absolutely not a legal consultant, so you'll have to agree with your legal teams what's best to put into those agreements. We'll talk about the risk assessment later, but that is part of your due diligence, is looking at what are the possible challenges and costs that will come by facing delays in delivering, dropouts, inflationary impacts on your supply chain. So that's something that I definitely recommend looking back at your own experience or pooling your experience into a lessons learned with any potential members to understand how you can head off those risks, and then see how that would feed into the terms of your consortium agreement. Building in performance management within that agreement is also key. You might not feel like there are KPIs to directly link to. In most funding agreements, there are milestones to which you have to deliver. For example, the number of homes assessed, the number of homes completed for installations, and then number of homes meeting EPCC or the performance outcomes. You may want to directly link your grant funding agreements to your performance management agreement terms. However, it may also be something you want to think about in terms of how you want to perform as members and those behaviours you want to see. Contingency for leadership is also a big one. As I said, that dropouts are a potential derailer of many consortium bids and delivery. And so defining those actions of who would be seconded in the processes to go through is going to be key, of including that in the consortium agreement. Insurance considerations, I won't go too much detail with this one, but that again is something you're putting in terms of your risk assessment. It's that mitigation that's going to be in place to make sure that every member feels comfortable. That also adds towards your transparency and make sure that everyone understands what the routes are out if they need to exit the consortium. And it gives you that kind of clarity over what happens in a risk situation. Often we find that information is not disclosed when the exit paths don't look that clear. If that makes sense. The communication plan, again, is another way to ensure that the terms of reference of how the consortia will operate are defined at the start. I didn't really say it in the beginning of this section, but with consortium agreements, it's a good way to co-design your membership and how you want to operate and your long-term goals. So that communication plan is definitely something we'd advise you co-create with your members so that everyone's on board. The data sharing agreement is something that, as I said, it can take a little while as a lead-in, but it also has a lot of potential to enable you to collect and share ideas. And this is one of the key benefits of working together in a consortium. Task and responsibility allocation is a very clear one that we just covered about roles and responsibilities and governance processes. But in this consortium agreement or collaboration agreement, it's a chance to specify who's responsible for each task, or at least the process by which that's agreed. We've seen consortia who have a rotating chair, and this allows each member of the consortium to basically take ownership for a while and step down and relieve themselves from ownership too. It gives you that buy-in to the process, and it gives you that voice in shaping the processes as they form. So I think that's definitely one that you might want to consider. Are you in a static formation, or are you going to write in processes that enable you to shift that responsibility so that everyone has a way of co-designing the process of how you cooperate? With that exit strategy as well that I touched on in the slide before, that is just a standard agreement process that allows you to understand what the notice period would be if you were to drop out. This is not only useful for reporting back up into a funder, for example. So if you're doing monthly reporting and you know that someone's going to be exiting, you know that they have to give X amount of months, you can already start reporting that into the funder, which gives early indication of risk, and you can then demonstrate how you're mitigating that. When we talk about types of agreement, the ones that I've picked out here just to talk about today is about collaborative agreements, memorandums of understanding, so those that might not be so legally, but that aren't legally binding, but then you might start moving more into like a service level agreement and a joint venture agreement. So for the purposes of this conversation today, we're just looking at a collaborative agreement and its pros, and then we'll go into the other more formal agreements. So starting with collaborative working, you know, this is a joint agreement. It might just be a couple pages long, but it should cover off most of those area topics that we just covered. It's good for strategic working across an area. So for example, if you're working quite closely with partners already, you might find that this best suits you. And each member acts independently in the day-to-day operations, but you might share a resource or interest in a project. When you're moving through into a memorandum of understanding, this is a formal version of collaborative working agreement. It's a statement of serious intent. It's agreed to voluntarily by each of the partners, but you are committing resources and considering what you might need to do in more serious circumstances like exiting. It is morally enforced, but it does not create a legal obligation. We've also seen service level agreements set out, perhaps more in those managing agent operating models, because that's where you perhaps have more of a emphasis on needing a quality of performance to come through. So for example, this could be between a local authority who's working with a managing agent who then manages the supply chain for each of the members in the consortium. This sets out expectations, it's contractual, it's a very clear relationship of buyer and seller, and it wouldn't be used to underpin the consortium members necessarily. It would be maybe more to bring in that external party who does have those legal responsibilities for enabling you to deliver your works. With a joint venture agreement, this is where you're really coming together as a strategic partnership, perhaps with other bodies who aren't registered providers in a special purpose vehicle. You could see this example being used in heat networks. For example, if you have 4 parties who have housing stock in a local area, plus a local authority, plus a heat network provider, plus a delivery agent, they may form an SPV to come together so that they have a legally binding agreement that allows them to operate as a company in its own right to deliver the works to the area in a longer term partnership. This is often also a process in place for redevelopment projects, regeneration, but as I said, you could see it for something like a heat network coming forward. If we look at consortium management tools as well, the way I always see it is you just put in project management tools from before, during forming, managing, and the end of the contract. And so these tools that we're talking about, they're really about having your project objectives and KPIs defined at the very start. They are around having organizational charts for your roles and responsibilities. They're around having a task tracker and processes in place that break down the project, the delivery of the retrofit project into a work breakdown structure so that any lead applicant can see how each partner is delivering. And ultimately having that risk strategy and register that's held in tandem with the projects as they're being delivered, but owned definitely by the lead applicant so that they have oversight of any issues that might be coming up over the larger program. Consortium risk management as well is where I'd like to kind of open the floor and hear a bit more about everyone's experiences. But that risk management, I don't think we ever do it early enough, but I've seen some good examples of consortium members when forming who've come up to create a joint risk register. And this risk register has been a really good experience in terms of understanding different perspectives about the likelihood of an issue coming up, the impact in terms of cost, programmatic delay, maybe reputational risk, and also understanding what they feel the mitigation for that process is going to be. It's a really good kickoff meeting, actually. When you first sit down, you think of all the things that could go wrong and all the ways you can avoid them. One of the ways it's been done in the past is we've sat down and talked about lessons learnt, and through that lessons learnt process with all the different consortium members, we've been able to draw out some of the risks they faced and those mitigations of how they would address that this time going forward. The final point on that one there actually is around training and management, and what is the consortia operational approach going to be to managing risk. One of the benefits of coming together as consortia that we've seen has been that chance to learn from each other. And sometimes we've seen successful consortia embedding more shadowing opportunities across their members for their staff who aren't immediately involved in that core consortium management team. So that could be resident liaison teams talking with other resident liaison teams at other members' organisations to share ideas directly. It does give you that sense that you're in it more strategically and not just for a bid. I kind of jumped ahead of myself. I was too keen on the Friday. So I talked about, sitting down as a kickoff meeting as a consortium members and writing a statement of how you will approach risk. More formally, what you're doing when you're building that risk register is also understanding perhaps what you'd put in your collaboration agreement or memorandum of understanding. And that's where you're putting in checkpoints. When are we going to be reviewing risk regularly? What is our process for doing that? Who needs to be involved? And what are our expectations of those individuals in supporting the resolution? So what is that escalation process? You might also want to consider embedding, it was around performance metrics, but here this is the threshold for escalation. So, if a project looks like it's going to under-deliver by 5%, is that where we start looking at it more closely and understanding how we can bring it back on track? Additionally, when you're talking about considering which staff will be trained and owning risk, different organisations have their own ways of managing risk and different parties. Who needs to be involved from those organisations when you're talking about escalation routes and mitigation routes? One of the successful ways I've seen this managed is actually just having an operations manual for a consortium, which highlights all of the areas we've talked about already. A comprehensive operational manual which goes over who's responsible for what are the governance processes, how do we identify risk, what are our risk thresholds, and having that almost as a solid document that is shared with all the members so that they understand the terms of reference of how we cooperate, our strategic goals, but also, how we do the day-to-day of delivering the program. So in the past, we've seen different planning regulations across geographies has created different risks around delivering retrofit. And the consortia model has worked really well for being able to have regular meetings around planning focused issues so that they could brainstorm together ways of mitigating that. Communications issues is another one that often comes up, and the mitigation we've seen coming across this has been around having designated days to manage consortia queries as opposed to becoming overwhelmed with requests that come through the high peak times, such as monthly reporting. Another risk we often see is regional branding and messaging. So in terms of how do we communicate out our successes as a consortia when we're delivering retrofit? Is there a unified approach? Is there key messaging that's been agreed? One of the mitigations we've seen before on this is just having an agreed comms team who define the key messages and distribute those out to the consortium members so that they can be aligned. You have maximum effect because you're all communicating the same messaging and it doesn't put anyone's nose out